This old man was abandoned by his son and daughter-in-law at a remote nursing home to fend for himself. Unexpectedly, strange things began to happen as soon as he moved in. The old man had a strange dream. A face emerged in the water. The old man did not expect that the owner of that face would die in front of him the next day. Soon after, the old man discovered a monster trapped in the basement.
Zejdź w dół pod ziemię, w dół pod wodę. Znajdź kamień, zniszcz go, to nicość.
Then, bizarre events continued to occur one after another. The second victim predicted by the water also died in front of the old man. What was even more terrifying was that the next face that appeared was actually his own. Could he escape the prophecy of death? At midnight, the clock in the nursing home struck 12. Suddenly, a monstrous roar echoed from the basement. Something was trying to crawl out of the water. The next morning, a car drove closer and closer to the suburbs. In the back seat was an old man named Lucian. At his age, he should have been enjoying his twilight years, but now, his son and daughter-in-law had sent him to a nursing home in the suburbs. The son claimed that his wife was about to give birth, and they didn't have time to care for their elderly father. They suggested that he stay there temporarily, and once the baby was born, they would come to pick him up. They would come to take Lucian away right away. Lucian could only watch sadly as his son and daughter-in-law drove away. Then he went to the dormitory assigned to him at the nursing home to unpack his belongings. The room was already occupied by another old man. His name was Nolan. He seemed to be a kind person. He warned Lucian that unpacking his belongings might bring misfortune. After all, Nolan's last roommate had died after tidying up his things. Lucian was startled by this. Only then did the old man admit he liked to make jokes. However, Nolan then said a few true words. Most of the elderly staying in this welfare nursing home are in poor health, stubborn, and superstitious. If any issues arise, be sure not to argue with them, or else Lucian will definitely be the one to suffer.
Z konowałami też bywa różnie, ale idziesz pan do dyrektora, a on, jak pan się czuje? Jak tam, co tam? I wychodzi pan z całą garścią prochów.
So Nolan warns Lucian to be especially cautious of the director. Lucian silently keeps this in mind. That night, Nolan had fallen into a deep sleep, but the newcomer Lucian was still somewhat unsettled. He pulled out videos of his family taken while his wife was alive. The atmosphere at home was warm and cheerful back then. The more Lucian watched, the more engrossed he became. But at this moment, the small pool from before began to ripple again. It seemed that something was moving beneath the surface. Gradually, an old man's face appeared. The next second, Lucian awoke with a start from the dream. Thinking about the terrifying images from the dream, he took a long time to calm down. Nolan seemed unfazed. He asked Lucian what he had dreamed about. He also said to remember the dreams from the first night in a new place, as they are said to be likely to come true. Lucian was startled by this. He hurriedly washed up and ran downstairs to verify, and dashed out of the nursing home. Looking around anxiously, he indeed found a pool that looked exactly like the one in his dream. However, there was nothing at the bottom. Relieved, Lucian returned to the nursing home for breakfast. Nolan introduced him to 3 other old gentlemen, but suddenly, Lucian noticed that the old man with the white beard at the table across from him was actually the same person he had seen submerged in water in his dream last night. Lucian's heart raced with anxiety. He had never seen that old man before, so how could he have dreamed about him? Before Lucian could process his shock for too long, an accident occurred.
Leć po Ernesta, leć szybciutko. Spokojnie, spokojnie, no. Już chwileczkę.
Lucian's heart suddenly sank. Could his dream from last night be a prophecy of death? After returning to his room that night, Lucian wrote down the dream from the previous night in his notebook. The night was already deep. Lucian prepared to wash up and go to bed. Suddenly, he faintly heard a wretched cry coming from outside. At first, Lucian thought he might have misheard, but the strange sound came again. Lucian increasingly felt that there was something strange about the nursing home, so he quietly slipped out of his room. Following the source of the sound, he made his way to the basement of the nursing home. The strange cries grew clearer. Lucian then moved the old mattress aside. Sure enough, there was a hidden door underneath. The time struck 12 once again. The hidden door suddenly opened slowly by itself, as if inviting Lucian to enter and investigate. Gathering his courage, Lucian ventured inside. Behind the door, the space was filled with vines. A bizarre-looking monster was tangled in them. As soon as the creature saw Lucian enter, it began to entice him with words, saying that if Lucian set it free, it could fulfill any of Lucian's wishes, including those dreams that seemed out of reach. Lucian initially wanted to refuse, but the monster began reciting poetry. Lucian had once been a famous stage actor, but he had to end his acting career due to frequent forgetfulness of lines. The poem the monster was now reciting was one that Lucian loved the most. They recited the entire poem together.
Zejdź w dół pod ziemię, w dół pod wodę. Znajdź Znajdź kamień, zniszcz go, to nicość.
The monster also mentioned that the stone was not far away, under the monster's guidance. Lucian carefully prepared to descend the ladder into the depths. Unexpectedly, Lucian suddenly stepped into thin air. Lucian found himself waking up in bed, just as he thought last night's experience was another dream. He was shocked to discover that there were several scratches on his arm. This meant that what happened last night was definitely not a dream. Taking advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention to him, Lucian immediately ran to the basement, following the memory of last night. But when he moved the mattress aside to look, there was no hidden door at all. Just then, the director also arrived in the basement. He thought Lucian was having another episode of forgetfulness, so he took Lucian back to his office.
Jak pan sypia? Nie zauważył pan czegoś niepokojącego? Nie wiem, czego wcześniej pan nie miał.
The director meant that Lucian, being new, would naturally feel uncomfortable. If anything seemed off, he should report it to them immediately. After leaving the office, Nolan quietly asked Lucian during the worship service if the director had asked him whether he was sleeping well. It turned out that the director often asked this of other residents as well. According to Nolan, if any elderly resident said they were not sleeping well, the director would make that person take madness-inducing medication. Nolan even speculated that the director was in cahoots with the drug dealers to test new drugs on the elderly residents, and those who took the medication. Even if they claimed to see hallucinations, the nursing home could simply say they had lost their minds. In the end, no one would know how the elderly actually died after the service ended. Lucian felt even more frightened. Worried that he might be killed by those people, he returned to his room and pulled out his phone to call his son, hoping to have him come and take him away. No one answered the phone. Lucian's hopes were destined to turn into disappointment. That evening, the nursing home held a welcome ceremony for Lucian. To celebrate this happy occasion, the director even made an exception and prepared some drinks for the residents. Everyone ate, drank, and danced to the music. Nolan and Lucian sat together chatting again. Lucian couldn't help but talk about his glory days as a stage actor, but now, he could only stay in the nursing home. Lucian saw no glimmer of hope. It seemed he could only wait for death to take him away.
Jak tak sobie rozmawiamy, to cholernie przykre, że to już meta.
After Nolan finished speaking, he got up to dance. At this moment, Lucian, through the dancing crowd, saw his deceased wife appear among them. That night, Lucian ran outside to sober up. Once again, a sound came from the pool, trembling. Lucian walked over to take a look. To his shock, a face reappeared beneath the water. This time, it was an old woman named Aunt Fong. The next second, Lucian screamed and woke up in bed. It was yet another nightmare. Recalling the last experience, he feared that Aunt Fong might not have long to live the next day. The fitness instructor led the elderly residents in exercise. However, Lucian felt a sense of unease. He occasionally glanced back at Aunt Fong. Afterward, the doctor conducted a routine checkup on Lucian. Worried about Aunt Fong, he lied to the doctor, saying that Aunt Fong had just fainted in the gym. When she woke up, she seemed to want to keep it a secret. Lucian thought the doctor should check on her to prevent any real accidents from happening. The doctor casually said he would take a look that evening. Lucian watched a program on television. The expert was discussing the topic of death. Death is not the end. While it marks the end of the physical body, it is also the beginning of another phase.
I tak naprawdę tylko to liczy się w naszym życiu. Prawda, panie Lucjanie?
Lucian was startled by this. The program was discussing something that felt personal to him. He quickly fled from in front of the TV and went to find others to play cards. Only, the four-player group was missing Aunt Fong. A wave of unease washed over Lucian. The other two old men urged him to relax. They said Aunt Fong had a different sense of time. Unexpectedly, the next second, Mace pulled out a ghost card that shouldn't exist. Immediately, a woman's scream echoed nearby. Fortunately, it was just a false alarm. Aunt Fong came running to join the card game. Lucian let out a sigh of relief, only to find that he had wet his pants in the process. He didn't have the courage to tell anyone else, then ran back to the bathroom to change his pants. Looking at his increasingly aging reflection in the mirror, Lucian felt even sadder. Before long, Nolan returned to the room as well. Seeing Lucian writing in his notebook, he tried to offer some words of comfort. He said that if there was anything bothering him, he shouldn't keep it bottled up. If he wanted to talk, he would be a good listener. But just as he finished speaking, Lucian's phone rang. It was a call from his son. Lucian eagerly answered the phone. Meanwhile, an elderly resident was being picked up by their family from the nursing home. Mary was also waiting for her daughter to pick her up. However, the staff members who knew the situation quickly urged her back to her room. At this moment, Mace came running to play cards with Aunt Fong. The time struck midnight. Lucian fell into a dream. In the dream, he was back on the stage, reciting the poem that the monster had read. Gradually, Lucian began to repeatedly recite 2 lines of dialogue, the first being that he was the only one left, and the second that there was a glimmer of hope beneath the water. The next day, as soon as Lucian got up, he was pleasantly surprised to find his son had come to the nursing home, but he wasn't there to take Lucian away. Regarding his lack of contact with his father, the son's excuse was that he had been very busy, yet as he spoke, he seemed guilty, wondering how he could be so busy that he couldn't even make a phone call. Lucian couldn't bring himself to call out his son's lies. Afterward, his son pulled a large pile of belongings from the trunk. These were all of Lucian's personal items. His son told his elderly father that his wife was about to give birth, and he planned to renovate the old house. He wanted Lucian to live well in the nursing home, and once the renovations were complete and the baby was born, he would come to take Lucian back home. Lucian felt mixed emotions. He felt joy at the impending arrival of his grandchild, but also frustration at his son's excuse. Nolan noticed Lucian's unhappiness and quickly offered him gentle comfort. Although he was reluctant to accept that life could end in loneliness, the reality was just that. Lucian countered Nolan with his son's words.
Każdy tu jest tylko na chwilę. No, zostaje do końca.
Just as Lucian pulled out his dog's collar, a series of sirens sounded from downstairs. Nolan and Lucian went to the window to look outside. They saw that an ambulance had arrived at the nursing home. They went downstairs to check it out. To their shock, the person they were trying to save was Aunt Fang. Mace was heartbroken beside them. In the end, he watched helplessly as attempts to save his friend failed. Thus, the group was forever missing one member. Suddenly, Mace turned his anger toward Lucian. He said that ever since Lucian arrived, 2 people had died in succession. Nolan defended his roommate, saying that death was a natural occurrence there, but Mace refused to listen, cursing Lucian as a jinx. Lucian recalled the dream from the night before. Could it be that he truly brought death? That night, at midnight, Lucian lay in bed, tossing and turning. He found himself once again in the basement. The hidden door reappeared on the wall. Lucian slowly climbed down the ladder. To his surprise, there was a long corridor down there. Lucian groped his way forward slowly. It was eerily quiet all around. Lucian could only hear the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When he reached the stairs, he realized he was in an abandoned opera house. The stairs that descended seemed endless. Suddenly, Lucian faintly heard a strange growling sound. He quickly leaned against the wall and moved forward. Sure enough, there was a monster with a tail on the ground. As the creature slowly raised its head, Lucian turned and ran away. The monster chased after him. In a moment of danger, Lucian accelerated, shaking off the monster and returning to the basement. Unexpectedly, he collided with the director. Overwhelmed by a series of shocks, Lucian fell to the ground. When Lucian awakened again, the director was looking at him with concern. Then, Nolan had mentioned that paying would get you a nurse to look at your chest, and then his son and beloved dog, who were supposed to take him home, even his deceased wife, appeared one after another before Lucian. But it was clear that none of this was real. Lucian was getting confused between fantasy and reality. His wife lay next to him. Lucian softly called her name and reached out to touch her. To his surprise, he found several strands of her hair in his hand. When Lucian looked back, his wife had transformed into her appearance before passing away. The next second, sorrowful Lucian awoke from the dream again. At this moment, he was still on N4 drip. Nolan looked at him with a complicated expression. After hesitating for a moment, he finally spoke up. He had previously told Lucian that the nursing home would test new drugs on the elderly, so they had to be strong, or they would be left to die. Lucian was silent for a moment. He picked up his phone and dialed his son again, but it was in a state of not reachable. His son wasn't even answering the phone. Lucian was suddenly overwhelmed with sadness and began to cry. The next day, Lucian appeared particularly dejected. He had realized that his son wouldn't come to take him away anymore. At this moment, the nurse routinely distributed the medication that every elderly resident had to take. Reluctantly, Lucian took the medicine. That evening, Lucian struggled to put pen to paper for a long time. The thought of ending his life in the nursing home made him feel utterly disheartened. Then Lucian dreamt of the pool again, but this time, the face in the water was his own. Immediately after, Lucian jolted awake from the nightmare. He was so frightened that it took him a while to calm down. Lucian didn't want to die like this, so he begged Nolan to help him with a task. Nolan was silent for a moment but eventually nodded in agreement. Afterward, Lucian anxiously waited in his room for a long time. Finally, Nolan returned to the room. His clothes were bulging. It was unclear what he had stuffed inside. It turned out that Lucian had asked Nolan to help him steal a large piece of meat. However, Nolan didn't know what Lucian wanted a piece of raw meat for. Just as they were discussing this, the nurse came into the room with that day's medication. Lucian pretended to put it in his mouth, drinking water to swallow it down. But once the nurse left, Lucian quickly spat out the pill he had hidden under his tongue. In the middle of the night, while the nurse wasn't paying attention, Lucian stealthily took the keys to the medicine room. After successfully entering the medicine room, he took a bottle of sleeping pills from the cabinet. Then he placed the raw meat on the table and used a pen to poke several holes in the meat. Then he stuffed the holes with the sleeping pills. After doing all this, Lucian took the prepared meat to the basement. At this moment, the mouse-like monster was still guarding the abandoned opera house. Lucian chose a good spot to throw the meat. He threw the meat directly in front of the creature. The startled monster, unsuspecting, swallowed the piece of meat in one bite. Lucian watched nervously from above, afraid that the monster would discover him. On the other side, Nolan noticed during the night that Lucian was not in bed. He turned on the light and looked around, but couldn't find him anywhere. Just as Nolan was wondering, he spotted Lucian's notebook. He was shocked to find that there wasn't a single word written on it. On the other side, Lucian waited until the monster fell into a deep sleep, then quickly descended the stairs. It turned out that the elderly residents, like Lucian, were taking sleeping pills every day. Seeing that the monster was unresponsive, he prepared to quietly sneak into the room behind it. Unexpectedly, the monster flicked its tail and suddenly woke up. Immediately after, its tail sent the elderly Lucian flying to the ground. Fortunately, the medication had some effect, and when the monster attempted to attack again, it crashed through the railing. In the end, it fell into the abyss. Lucian lay on the ground, gasping for breath. Once he regained his composure, he didn't dare to waste a moment. He stepped forward, one step at a time, and pushed open the old wooden door. Behind the door was an empty chamber. Lucian slowly descended the staircase. At the end of the stairs was a pool, identical to the one at the entrance of the nursing home. The previously trapped monster had mentioned that there was a stone beneath the water. As long as the stone was destroyed, the monster could regain its freedom. Lucian peered into the pool and saw a dim blue glow in the water. Immediately after, Lucian jumped into the water. He swam to the glowing circle and took the stone at its center. The blue light instantly extinguished. Then, Lucian, panting, swam back to the shore with the stone in hand. Next, all he had to do was destroy the stone so that the monster could gain its freedom. Then Lucian could make a wish to continue living. Unfortunately, no matter how Lucian tried, the stone wouldn't move. He quickly took the stone to the kitchen and found a wooden mallet to hit it hard. What Lucian didn't know was that something was emerging from the pool. As he continued trying to destroy the stone, suddenly, a roar of anger echoed from behind him. Lucian turned around in horror as a terrifying scene unfolded. Lucian could only quickly find a place to hide, listening to the sound of the monster's tentacles scraping against the ground and getting closer. Lucian's heart raced, terrified, and he tightly closed his eyes. Gradually, the monster's roar was now right by his ear, but Lucian didn't have the courage to look up, no matter how much he prayed in his heart. The monster's hand had already reached the edge of the cabinet. Fortunately, Lucian held his breath and wasn't detected by the monster's sense of life. The monster lingered by the cabinet for a moment before finally turning and leaving. Throughout the ordeal, no matter how afraid Lucian was, he didn't dare to make a sound. When he sensed that the monster had seemingly left, Lucian mustered the courage to come out. He carefully approached the kitchen door with the stone in hand and peeked out, looking left and right. The monster seemed to be truly gone. But just at this moment, a small bird suddenly appeared in the room. Lucian was startled and cried out. Fortunately, it was just a bird. But before Lucian could calm his racing heart, he heard strange noises coming from the ceiling above him. Then, tentacles began to reach down. It turned out that the ugly monster hadn't left at all but had climbed onto the ceiling to spy on Lucian. Lucian was so frightened that he didn't dare to move, allowing the monster in front of him to grab his neck. Then he was slowly lifted into the air. The monster looked at the feeble human in its grasp. With an expressionless face, Lucian struggled to breathe as the monster tightened its grip and had no strength left to break free from the restraints. Lucian's legs twitched, then his eyes began to glaze over. Finally, his head tilted, and he died in the monster's grip. The stone in his hand fell to the ground due to the loss of strength. Strangely, the stone that had just been incredibly hard suddenly cracked open by itself. The imprisoned monster finally regained its freedom. The next day arrived. and outside the nursing home, everything was blanketed in white. Inside, the nurses and patients were either lying on the floor or slumped over in their chairs. It appeared that they had all lost their lives. The hallways, corridors, and dining areas were filled with corpses. The only person who could still move was surprisingly Lucian, who had died in the monster's hands last night. He slowly turned around to see his beloved wife appear before him once again. His wife wore a comforting smile, and Lucian finally smiled again. And so, the story came to an end. Sysonachna, as a deeply profound Polish horror film, with its obscure yet captivating narrative, constructs a terrifying world where reality and fantasy intertwine. Every detail contains the director's profound insights into humanity, life and death, and the soul. From the beginning, the film immerses the audience in the world of the protagonist, Lucian. Once a brilliant stage actor, he now finds himself in a career slump due to health issues. The death of his wife plunges him into endless loneliness and despair. After being abandoned by his son and daughter-in-law at the nursing home becomes a new starting point for his life. However, as the plot unfolds, every corner of the nursing home exudes an eerie atmosphere. It is no longer just a place for physical and mental healing in the real world, but rather an entrance for Lucian into the depths of his inner fantasy world. In reality, his disappointment, loneliness, and longing for his deceased wife transform into a passage to a mysterious world and a series of bizarre and fantastical experiences. The director, through delicate and intricate plot arrangements, blurs the boundaries between reality and fantasy. The audience feels as if they are immersed in Lucian's complex mental world, struggling to distinguish between the real and the imagined. The sense of immersion and tension is pushed to the extreme. The appearance of the monster in the film adds a rich layer of horror to the film, yet beneath it lies a profound symbolic meaning. From Lucian's mental state, the monster is a manifestation of his inner fears and self-repression. In the real world, Lucian faces career failure, the loss of his beloved, and other blows. His heart is filled with loneliness, fear, and confusion. These negative emotions continue to fester deep within him and finally manifest as the monster in his fantasy world. The monster's grotesque appearance and unpredictable actions are similar to the unspeakable fears lurking deep within Lucian. They represent his fears that are difficult to confront, reflecting his anxiety about the uncertainties of life. The threat of death, and the fear of losing his sense of self-worth, their existence, serves as a reminder to Lucian, and to the audience as well, that the emotions repressed deep within won't disappear simply because they are ignored. Instead, they will return in even more terrifying forms. In the end, Lucian chooses to reconcile with death. As the film states, death is not the end, it is the end of the physical body, but also the beginning of another phase, and love is the only meaningful thing in life. Overall, Sysonachna is not just a horror film. It is more like a philosophical poem about humanity, the soul, and life. The director uses unique storytelling and highly symbolic elements to guide the audience to confront their inner fears and reflect on the essence of life. If you enjoy my channel, please subscribe to it.